Chapter 4. Lydia. There is a particular kind of haunting that announces itself not with violence, but with intimacy. Not the haunting of horror films, the sudden apparition, the slammed door, the face in the mirror. Those hauntings are loud. They want to be noticed. They operate in the register of shock because shock is efficient, because shock bypasses the rational mind and goes directly to the oldest part of the brain, the part that was making survival decisions before language existed. This was not that kind of haunting. This was the kind that comes quietly, in the middle of ordinary moments, wearing the face of the person you love. This was the kind that doesn't announce itself at all, that accumulates instead, detail by detail, small strange thing by small strange thing, until the accumulation reaches a weight that cannot be attributed to coincidence or explained away by any of the rational mechanisms you have been deploying, with increasing desperation, to contain it. This was the kind that gets in through love. Because love is the condition of maximum openness. Love is the state in which your defenses are most comprehensively lowered, not because you are careless, but because you have decided that this specific person is worth the vulnerability of being fully known by them. And that decision, that beautiful and necessary decision, creates an opening that is also an exposure. Something had come through that opening, and it was wearing Hermione's face. It started with the music. Wednesday morning, 3 days after the necklace. Ron was in the office working, and Hermione was in the kitchen making breakfast. And from the kitchen came a sound that it took him a moment to identify, because it was so ordinary that his brain initially filed it under ambient and moved on. She was humming. He registered it as Hermione humming and returned his attention to his work. And then something snagged in the back of his mind, a small hook catching on something, and he stopped and listened. The melody was not one he knew, which was notable because he knew Hermione's musical vocabulary with the thoroughness of 2 years of shared playlists and road trips and mornings in shared kitchens. He knew what she hummed when she was happy, what she put on when she was working, what she reached for when she was sad. He knew her music the way he knew her handwriting, not as information, but as landscape, as something he moved through so regularly it had become invisible in its familiarity. This was not in that landscape. It was a melody with the particular quality of songs from the first half of the 20th century, a formal, slightly asymmetrical structure, the kind of melodic arc that popular music largely abandoned after the war in favor of the more direct geometries of rock and roll, and everything that followed from it. Something from the 30s or 40s, possibly, a ballad, slow and minor-keyed, with a cadence that felt like it was moving toward a resolution it kept deferring. He didn't recognize it. He got up from the desk and went to the kitchen doorway and stood there watching her. She was making eggs. Her back was to him, moving between the stove and the counter with the easy physical efficiency she had in kitchens, and she was humming the melody continuously, with the unself-conscious quality of someone who is not aware they are making sound. The way people hum when the music is coming from somewhere internal rather than being produced for an audience. He said her name. She turned around, smiling, completely present, completely herself. She said, "Eggs." He said, "What are you humming?" She looked at him. Then she tilted her head slightly, the gesture of a person turning their attention inward, checking. Her expression shifted through something he couldn't quite read and then settled. She said, "I don't know." He said, "You don't know the song." She said, I didn't realize I was humming." She paused. "I don't know where it came from." He said, "Can you hum it again, deliberately?" She tried, stopped almost immediately, said, "I can't access it on purpose, it was just there." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the directness she always had and said, "I know." He said, "Do you think?" She said, "Yes, I think it's hers." They ate breakfast mostly in silence, the particular silence of two people who are both thinking about the same thing and have temporarily run out of ways to say it. The kitchen rearrangement happened on Thursday. Ron came downstairs in the morning to find the kitchen subtly different. Not dramatically, nothing had been moved to a new room, nothing was obviously out of place, but the arrangement of things on the counter had changed. The coffee maker, which had been on the left side of the counter near the window, was now on the right. The dish rack, which had been beside the sink, was now across from it. The arrangement of the spice jars, which Hermione organized alphabetically, which was a system Ron teased her about and she defended with complete seriousness, was different. Not random, not disordered, but differently ordered. A different logic. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at this, and then he went to find Hermione. She was in the backyard, standing near the apple tree corner, not too close, but looking at it with her coffee in the early morning light. When Ron came out, she turned and he checked her eyes. He was always checking her eyes now. It had become the first thing he did, the reflex that had developed in 3 days, and they were hers. Completely. He said, "Did you rearrange the kitchen?" She looked at him, then at the house, then back at him with the expression of a person who is receiving an answer to a question they hadn't known they were asking. She said, "No." He said, "The coffee maker is on the other side." She said, "I didn't move it." He said, "You were up before me." She said, "I've been out here since 6. I didn't go into the kitchen." They looked at each other. He said, "Then who?" She said, "She did." He said, "While you were." "While I was asleep, I think, or before I fully woke up." She paused. She knows where things should go in that kitchen. She lived in that kitchen. She looked at the house again. She's not trying to disturb us. She's putting things back the way she had them. Ron turned and looked at the kitchen window. The coffee maker visible through it, on the right side where Lydia Marsh had apparently kept hers in 1943. He said, "That's..." "I know," Hermione said. He said, "We need to talk about boundaries." She said, "Can you set boundaries with a ghost?" He said, "I don't know, but I think we should try." They tried. That evening, sitting together in the kitchen, which Hermione had, in the afternoon, quietly restored to its previous arrangement, moving the coffee maker back to the left, reorganizing the spices, restoring her own order to the space, Ron spoke aloud to the room. He felt slightly ridiculous doing it, but he did it anyway, because the alternative was silence, and silence felt like surrender. He said, addressing the kitchen generally, in the reasonable tone he used for difficult conversations, "I don't know how much you can hear or understand, but Hermione is my wife, and this is our home, and I need you to ask before you use her body or move our things. We want to help you, but we need you to work with us, not around us." The kitchen was quiet. Hermione, sitting across the table from him, watched the walls. Nothing happened. Ron said, "Okay," and then, because it seemed right and because he meant it, "And I'm sorry about what happened to you. I know about Edgar, I know what he did. I'm sorry nobody knew sooner." The kitchen was still quiet. And then Hermione made a small sound. Not a word, not a cry, the involuntary small sound of a person who has just felt something unexpected. She put her hand over the locket and looked at Ron with wide eyes and said, "She heard you." He said, "What did she?" She said, "Not words, just feeling, like," she searched, "like the way you feel when someone says exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment and your body responds before you can think." She pressed her hand harder against the locket. "She heard you." He looked at his wife's face, which was her face, fully hers, but with a surface emotion on it that was not hers, a surfacing grief that was older than anything Hermione had reason to carry. He said, gently, to the room, to the locket, to whoever was listening, "We'll figure this out together." He found the journal on Friday. Not accidentally, Hermione had mentioned it, had said she'd been writing, had said she wanted to document things clearly while she could. He knew about the journal, but he found it not on the desk where she'd been writing, but on the kitchen table, open, as if it had been set down mid-entry and left. As if someone had been writing and had been interrupted or had simply stopped, for reasons of their own. Hermione was in the shower. He had 10 minutes. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the open journal. The first several pages were in Hermione's handwriting. Her handwriting that he knew as well as his own, the particular slant and pressure of it, the way her letters connected. the specific shape of her capitals. She had been writing since the night of the necklace. It appeared daily entries, sometimes twice daily, documenting with the careful precision she brought to everything. What she felt, what she observed, when she felt Lydia's presence and when she didn't, what the presence felt like from the inside, what changed and what stayed the same. He read quickly, not wanting to take more than his 10 minutes. The entries in Hermione's hand were measured, intelligent, carefully observed. She noted the warmth of the locket as a barometer of Lydia's proximity, warmer when the presence was stronger, cooler during the periods of what she called ordinary life, when she could go hours without being aware of anything unusual. She noted the dreams. She had dreamed of the cellar again, twice more, and had gone further into it each time. She noted the humming, "I don't choose it." It arrives fully formed, like a memory of a song you learned in childhood. You don't remember learning it, but you know every note. She noted something else that Ron read twice. She wrote, "I don't think she is trying to take me. I think she is trying to tell me something." There's an urgency to the presence when it's strongest, not aggression, but the urgency of someone who has been trying to communicate for a very long time and has finally found a medium that can receive. She doesn't want my life. I think she wants a witness. She needs someone to know what happened to her and to say so, out loud, on the record. He read this and thought about Lydia Marsh, reported missing by the man who had killed her case closed without resolution, her name in the records as a woman who had simply left. As a woman who had walked away, as a woman who had chosen absence. He thought about 80 years of that, of being the lie that someone else told about you, permanently, in the official record, with no one to correct it. He turned the page, and the handwriting changed. It didn't change dramatically. It wasn't the Hollywood version of a possession, the wild, uncontrolled scrawl, the different pen pressure, the sudden shift to an entirely foreign script. It was subtler than that, which somehow made it more disturbing. The letters were the same letters, the same alphabet. But the way they were formed was different, more deliberate, more careful, with the particular penmanship of someone taught in an earlier era when handwriting was a formal skill, when the shaping of letters was something you practiced and took pride in. The slant was different. The spacing was different. The pressure on the downstrokes was heavier. Different hands, two different people's hands had been holding this pen. He looked at the transition point, the place on the page where Hermione's writing ended and the other writing began. There was no visible break. The sentence that ended in Hermione's hand and the sentence that began in the other hand were consecutive, fluid, as if the person writing had simply continued without pause, as if the transition between them had been seamless in the moment of its happening. He read the sentence in Hermione's handwriting that preceded the change. "Sometimes when I write, I feel the pen moving differently, as if someone else is." And then the new hand, completing the sentence. Remembering how to do this. He sat very still. He read on. The new handwriting, Lydia's handwriting, he was certain of it, with the certainty that was becoming familiar, the certainty that arrived before the analytical mind caught up, continued for half a page. The content was not dramatic. It was, in its way, almost more disturbing for its lack of drama. It was an account, specific, sequential, factual. The kind of account a person gives when they have been waiting to give it for a long time and have had 80 years to decide what to include and what order to put it in. It began, "My name is Lydia Ann Marsh. I was born Lydia Ann Callow in Roanoke, Virginia, in 1922. I was married at 19 to Edgar James Marsh, and I came to this house on Hollow Creek Road in October of 1941 as his wife. I want to tell the truth of what happened here because the record that exists is his record, and it is a lie, and I have waited long enough for it to be corrected." He read this paragraph 3 times. Then he read the rest. It was not long, half a page, as he'd estimated, in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a woman describing her own death with a composure that Ron found almost unbearable. She wrote about Edgar without visible emotion, no hatred, no fear. Though the facts she described warranted both, in the way a person writes when the emotion has had 80 years to settle into something more fundamental than feeling, something that lives below feeling, in the bedrock. She wrote about the house, about the 2 years of her marriage that had preceded October 1943, about the particular quality of Edgar's rages, which were not frequent but were thorough, about the October afternoon when she had understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes to people in extremis, that this particular rage was different in kind from the previous ones, that this one had a quality of finality. She wrote about the corner of the backyard, about the roses she had planned to plant there in the spring. She wrote about the pot. She had sealed the necklace in it herself, in the brief window between understanding what was about to happen and the happening of it. She had gone outside and dug and buried it. Her own necklace, my mother gave it to me, and I was not going to let him have it, and the pot she had taken from the kitchen shelf, and the wax from the candle on the table. And then, at the bottom of the half page, a single line that was not part of the account. That stood apart from it, with a space above and below, as if she had written the account and then waited a moment and then added this, separately. He buried me where the roses were supposed to grow. Ron sat at the kitchen table with the journal open in front of him and heard the shower shut off down the hallway. He had 4 minutes. He read the line again. He buried me where the roses were supposed to grow. He thought about the rosebud he had seen at the base of the apple tree the morning before, the single deep red bud in the dark soil, where nothing had been growing the day before it appeared. He thought about Hermione standing at the kitchen window on their first evening saying, "That corner is going to be roses," with the certainty of a person whose instincts were almost always right. He thought about the depth in Hermione's eyes that morning in the backyard, the thing looking out from further back than he was accustomed to seeing. He closed the journal carefully, set it back exactly where he'd found it, open to the same page at the same angle. He got up from the table and went to the kitchen counter and put the kettle on and stood with his back to the table and listened to Hermione moving down the hallway toward him, and he understood something that the account in the journal had made unavoidable. Lydia Marsh was still in the backyard. Not her consciousness, not her presence, those were here in the house, in the locket, in his wife's body. But her bones. 80 years in the ground, in the corner where the roses were supposed to be, with no record of her death, no correction of the lie her husband had put in the official record, nothing between her and the erasure that Edgar had intended when he filed that missing persons report and walked away from this house and let the world believe she had chosen to leave. There was a knock at the front door. Ron went to the door. Standing on the porch was an old man, 70, perhaps a little more, with the particular leanness of someone who has worked physically all their lives and whose body has retained the memory of that work even as the work itself has diminished. He was wearing a canvas jacket and holding his hat in his hands, a formal gesture, a gesture that belonged to an older way of meeting people. And his face had the specific weathered quality of someone who has spent most of their life in outdoor air in all seasons. He said, "Morning, you the new family at this property?" Ron said they were, told him his name. The old man said his name was Carl Whitfield. He said he grew up in this house. His parents had bought it in 1944. He'd lived in it until he was 22. And when his parents passed, the property had eventually come to him, and he'd rented it out for some years before finally selling it. He said he'd been meaning to come by since he'd seen lights on in the windows, but he was an old man, and getting around took longer than it used to. Ron said, "Your parents bought this house in 1944. Carl Whitfield said that was right. Ron said, "From Edgar Marsh." Something crossed the old man's face. Not surprise, more the expression of a person who has been carrying a specific weight for a long time and has just heard someone else acknowledge the weight exists. He said, "That's right." Ron said, "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, Ron, Carl Whitfield, and Hermione, who had come out of the bedroom with her hair still damp from the shower and had taken one look at the old man sitting at her kitchen table and sat down without being asked, with the stillness of a person in whom something has just become very attentive. The locket at her throat was warm. Ron could see from the way she held herself that it was warm. Carl Whitfield told them what he knew. He told it in the way old people sometimes tell difficult things, carefully, with pauses, selecting words with the deliberateness of someone who has thought about what to include and what to leave out, and has decided on honesty. He said his parents had bought the house from Edgar Marsh in the spring of 1944. He said that Marsh had seemed, to his parents, like a man who needed to be somewhere else quickly, who was selling below value and who wanted no extended transaction, no relationship with the buyers, a clean handoff and a departure. He said his parents had moved in and found the house in the condition of a place where someone had left without preparing to leave. Things still in the cupboards, things still in the closets. The kitchen arranged the way someone had arranged it for their own use, not cleared for a handoff. He said his mother had found something in the backyard. Ron said, in the far corner by the apple tree. Carl looked at him. Ron said, the soil there, she found something about the soil. Carl said quietly, she found it warm, even in winter. She planted roses there one spring and they grew faster than they should have. She always said there was something in that corner that she didn't understand. Hermione made a small sound. When Ron looked at her, she was looking at Carl Whitfield with the expression of a person receiving confirmation of something they had known and not yet been able to verify. Carl said, my mother used to hear things in this house at night, not sounds exactly, more like a feeling. Like someone was present in a room you just left, like the feeling of a conversation that had just ended. He looked at his hat in his hands. She never said so when we were children because she didn't want to frighten us. She told me when I was grown. She said she thought it was the woman, the one who'd been here before. She said she thought the woman was still in the house somehow and was, he paused, was waiting for something, was trying to be heard. He looked at Hermione, at the locket. He said, I see you found her necklace. Hermione said, you knew about it. He said, my mother found the pot once while she was gardening. She didn't open it. She said it felt like something that wasn't meant for her and she put it back. He paused. I think she was right. I think it was waiting for the right person. Hermione's hand went to the locket. Carl Whitfield said, I'll tell you what my mother believed for whatever it's worth to you. She believed that woman never left, not because she couldn't, but because she was waiting for someone to tell the truth, to put it on the record, to say officially that she didn't leave, that she was taken, that Edgar Marsh was a liar and a murderer, and that her name deserved to be corrected in whatever record had her down as a missing person. He looked at Ron. My mother tried to report it once, in the 50s. Went to the sheriff's office and said she thought the woman who'd lived in this house before them had been killed by her husband and buried on the property. They didn't take it seriously. Different time. He stood, put his hat back on his head with the careful gesture of an old man who still treated hats as hats rather than accessories. He said, I came to tell you what I knew, and to tell you if the house is active again, that it's not malicious. That woman was not a malicious person. She was a young woman who deserved better than she got, and she's been here ever since, trying to get it. He said at the door, the roses she planted always came back, every spring. My mother never replanted them. They just came back. He left. Ron and Hermione sat at the kitchen table after his car disappeared down the driveway. The kitchen was quiet. Then Hermione said, we have to report it. He said, I know. She touched the locket. She said, she needs her name corrected. That's the first thing. That's what she's been waiting for. He said, I know. She looked at him across the table. The locket warm between them, almost visibly warm, the warmth of a thing that has been waiting in the cold for 80 years and has finally found the beginning of what it needed. She said, Ron. He said, yeah. She said, she wrote something in the journal. He looked at her. She said, you read it. He said, yeah. She said, say it out loud. I need you to say it out loud. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the window, at the backyard, at the corner where the apple tree stood, and the soil was dark, and the single rosebud bent in a wind that was not quite blowing. He said, quietly and clearly, to the kitchen, to the house, to the backyard, to whoever was listening. He buried you where the roses were supposed to grow, and we know, and we're going to make sure everyone knows. The kitchen was very still. And then Hermione closed her eyes. And when she opened them, the depth was there. The back wall moved. The additional dimension, the layer further back, the space for something Ron couldn't see in the dark of it. Her eyes, completely her eyes in every physical particular, looking at him from further away than they usually looked. And in a voice that was Hermione's voice, and underneath, it's something else. Something that had the acoustic quality of a thing that has not spoken in anger in 80 years, and is not speaking in anger now, but in something that is the residue of anger, the sediment of it, the thing that remains after the feeling has burned itself out, but the truth of it endures. Lydia Marsh said, "Thank you." That night, Ron sat alone at the kitchen table after Hermione had gone to bed. He sat with a glass of water, and the journal and the property records he'd printed, and Carl Whitfield's visits sitting in his mind like objects on a table, each one real and solid, and together forming the shape of something he had to find a way to hold. He thought about Lydia, about 19 years old and married and brought to this house, and what those 2 years had been like, the 2 years between the wedding notice in the newspaper and the missing persons report. He thought about her going outside with a pot and a candle and her own necklace and burying it in the ground while there was still time. That act of defiance, that small, fierce act of preservation, my mother gave it to me, and I was not going to let him have it in the last minutes of her life. He thought about what it meant to be erased, to have the record of your life end with a lie that someone else told, to have the official story of you be the story of your disappearance rather than the story of what was done to you. He thought about what it meant to have been waiting for 80 years for that to change. He looked at the journal, open on the table, at the line in Lydia's handwriting, careful, deliberate, the handwriting of a woman who had learned to write with pride in an era when that mattered. He buried me where the roses were supposed to grow. He picked up the pen. Under it, in his own handwriting, he wrote, "We found you, Lydia. We're going to fix it." He set the pen down. He sat in the kitchen until the creek and the wind and the darkness of the valley had done their work, and he felt, if not at peace with it, then at least equal to it, at least capable of holding it without being broken by the holding. Then he went to bed. And in the corner of the backyard, in the dark under the apple tree, in the soil that was warm with 80 years of waiting, 3 more rosebuds appeared overnight. Not planted, not tended, simply there in the morning, small and tightly furled and deep red, growing up through the dark earth of the corner where the roses had always been supposed to be. Growing because someone had finally said the right thing. Growing because someone had finally come.